Welcome to our second session, studying Heart Treasure of the Enlightenment. Heart Treasure of the Enlightenment, in Tibetan we say Tokta Bardugewe Tam, which is the practice of you, meditation and action, a discourse virtuous in the beginning, middle and end. So we have here the root text by Tsar Paltrun Rinpoche, and then we have commentary by Kyabje Khyentse Dorje Chan, Dinghu Khyentse Rinpoche. So we'll begin with invoking the two authors in their, there's a classical liturgy for the two of them. First there is for Paltrun Rinpoche, where we say outwardly you are the Bodhisattva Shantideva, inwardly you are Shauralipa, Lord of Siddhas, and secretly you are truly noble Avalokiteshvara, dispeller of pain. I supplicate you, Jigme Chigi Ombo. And then invoking Dinghu Khyentse Rinpoche, we say embodiment of the twofold wisdom of all the Buddhas. You are Manjushri, play of wisdom's tenderness, great chariot of the Buddha's teaching, king of knowledge. I supplicate you, Pema Dongrak Lingpa. So the first four lines, they were written by Jaren Khyentse Wangpo. This was a praise of Paltrun Rinpoche. And when we say outwardly you are Bodhisattva Shantideva, it's because Paltrun Rinpoche was viewed as an incarnation or rebirth of Shantideva. And then also we would refer to him as a rebirth of Shauralipa. We say inwardly because this is more of a, let's say, secret style of practice. Shauralipa was a Mahasiddha. And then we say he is the embodiment of Avalokiteshvara in the form that we call Dungal Rangdra, dispeller of pain, or dispeller of pain. Actually, it's Dungal Rangdra means the natural liberation of suffering, but this is the form of Avalokiteshvara that we practice in the Longchen Nyingte. So this is according to Jigme Lingpa's visionary revelations. And then this is followed then by the invocation of Dinghu Khyentse Rinpoche. His name here, Pema Dongrak Lingpa, this is Dinghu Khyentse Rinpoche's what we call Teta name, the treasure revealer name, that when we have lamas who are treasure revealers, they generally have the name Lingpa, which indicates that they are treasure revealer. So with these two sublime beings, then we'll look at the text itself. So we've covered the opening verses, and we're now looking at part one, the shortcomings of our decadent age. So here the root verses read, the true Rishi, the Munindra, God of gods, attained the true level through the true path and truly showed this true and excellent path to others. Isn't that why he's known as the true Rishi? So in the ancient India, then Rishis were the sages, and very often Rishis are portrayed as not wearing a lot of clothes and also having very long hair, in the form of the babas or the sadhus as we know them within within Indian culture. But what Rishi actually means, and the way that it's translated into Tibetan, is chanson. And this means somebody who's straight. It means somebody who is, straightforward or true. And this is what the Buddha is viewed as here, as someone who represents the quality of truthfulness. Also among the rishis, these great siddhas or masters, the Buddha is someone who possessed what we call the supreme siddhi, which is the supreme kind of accomplishment. And we talk about relative and absolute or supreme city, where the relative, these are the cities that include levitation, walking on water, being able to walk very swiftly or live in the cold and so forth. However, the real objective of the path, which is the supreme siddha, is then or supreme siddhi, is then the awakening, the mind that's no longer confused and no longer is held by the delusion of fixating on a self. Now, the Buddha attaining this comes from countless lives of practicing bodhicitta, exclusively wishing to benefit others. So we regard the Buddha as having been extraordinary, as someone who for 500 lifetimes was a bodhisattva and who throughout all these lives pursued the wish of benefiting others. So presently, we would want to emulate and follow the Buddha's example, and as such, we can do this on the basis of following our own teacher. And so the example of the Buddha and also the presence in our lives of having a teacher who is also honest is something that we should appreciate. And in apprenticing or following, becoming a student of a teacher, then we should also welcome the teacher's criticism, that we might be with a teacher who is honest, but the teacher is not going to be honest in terms of sitting around and honestly describing other people's flaws or discussing the shortcomings of the present day and age. Of course, the teacher might do that, but particularly what will benefit us is if the teacher is straightforward with regards to our shortcomings. So it's not as if we should regard the teacher as being wonderful as long as the teacher is sort of placating our expectations and needs. We should be particularly grateful when the teacher exposes our shortcomings. That's where we would welcome the teacher's honesty. Khyentse Rinpoche says, followers of the Buddha, whether learned sages, accomplished meditators, or just ordinary people like ourselves, should follow the path properly. Even in ordinary life, people respect someone whose mind and behavior are straightforward and true, but a dishonest person is trusted by no one. So the spirit of the present work that we're studying, particularly in regards to exposing the shortcomings of this present day and age, is very much one of honesty and being straightforward in regard to the nature of this day and age, and also the nature of practitioners and so forth. So we should welcome that spirit of honesty. In the next verse, then, Paltrul Rinpoche writes, alas, for people in this age of residues, the mind's wholesome core of truth has withered, and people live deceitfully. So their thoughts are warped, their speech is twisted, they cunningly mislead others. Who can trust them? So when we talk about the age of residues, we're comparing this to the golden age, and in Indian cosmology, we speak of our world and the universe in terms of cycles. So we've been through the golden age, and at that time, then in the golden age, beings lived for a very, very long time. They didn't really have bodies as we know them now in terms of gross material bodies, but they had bodies of light. They had the capacity to travel without touching the ground and so forth. And compared to beings of that golden age, then, of course, for us, we see ourselves as normal, but for the sages, the rishis and so forth, who can kind of see throughout the ages what has been and what is now, we could say that beings now have lost this natural beauty. We don't exactly have bodies of light. We need to travel in very very sort of in very pedestrian manner and so forth. And so, so compared to that, we would say present-day beings are an object of compassion. We could say for sublime beings, then looking at us in this day and age, they would feel pity for us, and particularly. Well, of course, this is latent in beings at all ages and so forth. Then the present-day persons, they're really driven in a very sort of gross and heavy way by deceit and self-centering. So sometimes when we talk about the age of residues and the present day, it's not just in terms of losing the beauty of the body of light, but it's specifically in terms of being afflicted by neurosis and neurotic actions. And all of that comes about through the confusion that drives this deceitful way of being, and also, of course, the root of it is seen as being our self-centering. So our present day experience, beings in this age of residues, is really one where our physical, verbal, and mental actions are very much tainted by this confusion and this self-centering. If we look, then we have some great teachers, we have some great masters and so forth, some sublime beings, but we also have many who have left. And even within Buddhism in the modern world, we can look at the last 50 years or so, where there's been exposure for Westerners to great masters in all the various Buddhist traditions. We can try and reflect how many of these great masters that have names, such as Dingpo Rinpoche and the Karmapa and so forth, Chobgit Chichen, and many great masters who were around, Tugu-Ujin Rinpoche, Nyoshu Khen Rinpoche, and so forth, have left. And also in terms of just beings, the beings and the general, the way that sentient beings are engaging in the Buddhist teaching, we can see more and more beings are being confused and impressed by superficial sciences and so forth, and abandoning the insight of the enlightened Dharma. So we have this situation. What's implicit in this is not so much despairing, but it's more realizing that right now we are particularly fortunate because we do have still some teachers and we are practicing the Dharma, and we need to engage in with an awareness of the fragile situation that we're in. We need to engage with a determination to not be caught up in our ordinary confusion and limitations. And we need to be particularly attentive to the afflictions of the mind. And that is also where the honesty of Paltram Rinpoche comes into play, where we encourage very much to be attentive to our shortcomings. So we have in the Kadampa tradition, the tradition of Atisha, where they say, I will hold the spear of mindfulness at the gate of the mind. And when the emotions threaten, I too will threaten them. When they relax their grip, only then will I relax mine. So what is meant is that with an awareness of our tendency towards self-centering and afflicted states of mind, then we would want to keep mindfulness, the condition of the mind that is aware of what's happening in the mind and what's conducive for happiness and awakening. We should keep that presence of mind, and whenever we have neurosis, whenever we have self-centered inspirations and so forth, we're attentive to that and we don't let it get the better of us. Before we begin to act on our afflicted conditions of mind, then usually there's an awareness of what's going on in our mind. So as soon as that happens, then as soon as these tendencies arise in the mind, then our mindfulness should be right there and make sure that they don't actually enter the mind, or they don't really get a grip on the mind. In verse 6, Paltram Rinpoche says, "Alas, how depressing to see the beings of this degenerate age. Alas, can anyone trust what anyone says? It's like living in a land of vicious man-eating demons. Think about it and do yourself a big favor." So we're not going to have a lot of congratulations about the progress and the present state of affairs. It's rather about us being totally candid about the situation with living in a world of neurotic, self-centered persons. And it's not that hard, really, to look at the news and trace the genealogy of crimes of enrichment, crimes of hatred, and so forth, back to subjectivities that are confused and self-centered. So keeping that in mind, this is not necessarily about anybody intrinsically being good or intrinsically being bad. It's just that all beings, they are held by this. So it's a little bit like we live in sort of this situation of man-eating ogres, in that everybody is held and permeated by this toxic condition of self-centering and neurosis. So taking that into account, we just shouldn't pitch our expectations too high with regards to our fellow humans. We, of course, trust their intrinsic goodness, but we also are aware of the confusion that rules them. And that's why we say ordinary confused persons cannot be relied upon. We wouldn't want to try to change them unless we're, you could say, asked. In general, it just doesn't work. We shouldn't preach. We shouldn't try to change people out there. We should rather actually try to change ourselves. That's the nature of Dharma. And that's where we would practice as we become aware of what's happening in our mind. We practice the antidotes of the mind. We are equipped with some knowledge of the teaching, and we are able to, with the knowledge we have, to do something about our states of mind. Whether we are practitioners of Tsokpa Chenpo, or whether we're practitioners of monastic discipline, or whatever it might be, we have many different antidotes, and there are ways to transform the neurosis of the mind. Now, to work on ourselves is not some sort of selfish, narcissistic project. It's about getting down to the bottom of what actually drives the suffering in the world. Of course, it doesn't mean that we should not be active in terms of ordinary activities. We can be politically active, we can support things that are helpful to the larger community. But at the end of the day, to actually get down to what really matters is to be aware of the mind and deal with it. And this is actually something that will be addressing what really ails or what afflicts everyone. Khyentse Rinpoche says, whatever suffering we may experience now, we should use it to remind us of compassion and love, to sweep away our evil deeds and obscurations, and to spur ourselves on as we travel the path of deliverance. We must understand the nature of samsara and see clearly it is that its only antidote is the practice of Dharma. So with an awareness of the condition of the world, we should have compassion, and whenever we're suffering, we should see this as something that inspires us to pursue the path of liberation. We should understand that what's really going to help is the practice of Dharma. Everything else is really just patchwork, secondary solutions. In verse 7 then, Paltram Rinpoche says, not long ago, your consciousness was wandering alone. Swept along by karma, it took this present birth. Soon, like a hare pulled out of butter, leaving everything behind, you'll go on again alone. So, we're here for a very short time, and it's not long ago since we were born, and it won't be long until we will meet with someone who's for sure going to take us out. There's no way that we could actually negotiate with this one, and this is death. this invincible enemy is approaching. So for that very reason, for the reason that it's absolutely certain that death is coming and that it's absolutely uncertain when the time will be, then postponing the practice of Dharma is not going to be something very useful. It just won't work. We could leave at any given time. So we would want to also understand that Tibetans, they say, not only they say in general, they would say there's more reasons, there's more circumstances that bring about death than circumstances that bring about life. And we don't really think about it, but the fact is that almost anything, any circumstance, just sitting on a chair can somehow lead to death. Something can fall on our head, we can fall off the chair in an unfortunate way. Pretty much any circumstance can bring death. And when this moment happens, then only confidence in our being, the subtle mind, is going to be something that helps us. There's nothing presently really that prevents us from practicing. Like Khyentse Rinpoche says, it's not as if we're living in a totalitarian context where it's forbidden for us to practice the Dharma. Khyentse Rinpoche himself had many, many acquaintances for whom that was a fact. And so we should recognize our present freedom. And so we should persevere in the practice, and we should also reflect on the nature of death and what happens to us when we die. Presently in the Buddhist context, it's not a mystery or something that's unknown. We have a science around what death entails. And it's not speculative. It doesn't really fall into these cliches we have in the modern world where we say, well, we don't really know what happens when we die. That's not at all true. There's a lot of knowledge in all sorts of ways that the modern world excels in, but certainly when it comes to consciousness and what happens after death, modern science has absolutely no idea, but that is the domain, and that is the scope of the Buddhist teaching. And that's where we could study these teachings and we could see what is it actually that happens. Khyentse Rinpoche says, we make strenuous efforts to ensure that in the future we will not run out of money, run out of food, or be without clothes. But of all future events, isn't death the most crucial? So many of us, we make sure that we save up for old age, our pensions, our superannuation, and so forth. And what's not part of the larger conversation is what actually is happening with us when we die. And isn't that actually the most important? The rest of our life might only be a few decades, but the future beyond that extends into infinity. Also, Rinpoche says, this is the most important task in your life, and you shouldn't be indecisive about it. If you think you will practice later when you have more free time, when you're older, or when you find a more suitable place, you'll never get down to practicing at all. It's very often the case in Asia that you say, well, when you're young, you should be responsible and work hard, and then you can always practice religion when you get older. And that's something actually in the Buddhist teaching we do not endorse, because there's no guarantee whatsoever that we will arrive at a ripe old age. So sort of this idea that I'm going to work for a number of years and then I'm going to practice for a number of years is highly unrealistic and very tentative, speculative. And certainly that kind of approach is not recommended. Let's see here. Okay. What when someone is not concerned about the future? How then may such a one even consider the need to prepare for death? Well, it's Khyentse Rinpoche talks about that a bit later. And yes, for those who don't think about these things, then the consequence is that there's not really any particular liberation. Of course, we as caring persons that are connected to such people would hope that due to their good disposition, they might fare well and so forth. The thing about samsara is that we're really just like, Paul's Rinpoche gives the example of an insect stuck inside a jar. So we might be up for a bit, but then again, we might also go down. So particularly as long as our present day, you could say, climate or science or whatever, our discourse excludes any sort of serious comment on what happens after death, it's very difficult actually to encourage people to be aware that they need to prepare for death. In my reading of the text so far, I didn't see any mention of whatsoever of engaging in ordinary life. Yes, it's very much about, in this text, and this of course comes from a great sage, someone who, in his example, not just in his words, abandoned ordinary life. So we have lots of advices that are about ordinary life, but in this text, then we actually get the hardcore foundation of, you could say, the culture that we have in many Buddhist civilizations of retiring to the caves and so forth. So, so it says, I very much get the feeling from everything I read that indeed we are all being instructed to leave all samsaric worldly activities behind, which is fine if it does mean that, or am I only getting the meaning? However, when we read and study such Dharma, how can we reconcile it with intimate love? Should we run a mile? Well, here we're getting some very candid instructions, and they are quite, yes, you could say they're quite clear on the pointlessness of ordinary life. We're going to have that a lot. That is, you could say, the honesty. At the same time, for many it will be difficult, and that's where we would say then of course it applies, we do what we can. So this applies, but you're certainly, here we are getting it served up, you could say, very directly from Paltram Rinpoche and Kinzer Rinpoche. Yeah, someone says, Paltram Rinpoche makes me want to jump into retreat. Yeah, that is actually the implication. Of course, we have to keep in mind, and having sort of, you know, we can see that in our culture, this is something new. So we don't presently really have a lot of structure for some of these things that are proposed here. At the same time, us studying this, we'd want to hear what the sages of Tibet had to say about this. I wonder of this so as to feel the best way to encourage such discussion. Yes, but you know, this is also where Paltram Rinpoche said, actually, he says, for the time being, better just to work on ourselves. And then once we have experience and realization, then we can help others. But you know, also what there's sort of a magic element that takes place when we have genuine realization, then others spontaneously will ask us. Then they will naturally be inclined to request our guidance and so forth. But of course, at the same time, if we're sitting with peers and we are engaging in these kind of discussions, yeah, I think it's all right to just say, well, you know, the Tibetan sages, they have this perspective, and share the insights. In verse 8, Paltram Rinpoche says, of course, what we want is our own good. So we have to be honest with our own selves. If we don't accomplish the essence of the Dharma for our own sake, won't we be ruining our own life? So, as Kinzer Rinpoche says, it's not as if we want to be sick. People never think to themselves, how nice it would be if I could get to be sick. Or they want to be crippled or poor, or they're looking forward to being robbed. So let's just be clear, we don't want to suffer, we long for happiness. And as we very often, as we've already said earlier, our actions contradict our intentions. We wish happiness and yet we engage in the very causes for suffering. So this is where where there's a need for insight. So nobody wants to have any kind of suffering. And we're driven by this longing for happiness, which of course you could say is driven by an innate sanity, and yet this innate sanity has been hijacked by a delusional condition of self-centering. And that's what we call ignorance and the cause of samsara. And that's where we then actually confused, we launch into actions with our body, speech, and mind that is contrary to our wish for happiness. And that is based on this self-centering. So we're heavily involved with this kind of self-centered urge. And this thing is something that drives us at all times, where we are actually never satisfied with what we have. Even if we do care about others, it's more just for those that we think are ours. So if we look at it, the solution to this, both for ourselves and others, is to practice the Dharma. If we're just ignoring the Dharma, pursuing ordinary hedonic pleasure, just pleasure for the short-term happiness, and ignoring karma, this will lead to a lower rebirth where we won't encounter the Dharma. So the ordinary people that we are surrounded by, they're not going to be able to guide us in this regard. They cannot be trusted. So this is where we need to, without making a big fuss, without sort of proclaiming that we're disagreeing with everyone, just in a low profile, determined way, we dedicate ourselves to practice, and we begin with ourselves. Presently, we're not bodhisattvas, so we're not ready to help others. We start with disciplining ourselves, and in doing so, we create the conditions that we could actually practice and begin to get rid or free ourselves from patterns that are destructive. Khyentse Rinpoche says, although we love ourselves so dearly, we have no idea at all where to find real happiness. We are about as capable of looking after ourselves as a lunatic. We search for happiness in pleasure, fame, and wealth, oblivious to the fact that death will soon take all those things away. So, in the 9th verse, and actually this particular verse, then there is quite a bit of commentary from Khyentse Rinpoche. Actually, particularly then, he also says, in terms of us being changing ourselves, which is what it's about. It's not just that we're sort of like dutifully practicing our Buddhist path, but it's about really getting down to what it is that drives our neurotic action. There's very much this practice of picking ourselves up or freeing ourselves. And he quotes Nagarjuna. He says, someone who has acted carelessly, but later becomes careful and attentive, is as beautiful as the bright moon emerging from the clouds. So this is something, and you also find this quote in the words of my perfect teacher, this is something that implies this freedom that we have right now, where we actually could gently park at the curb, leave behind patterns that are decidedly destructive. Now, still within this verse then, the insight that frees us builds on discipline and ethical action. So this is where we first have the framework of behavior, but on the basis of that, then we work with the more subtle aspects, such as meditation and wisdom. Now, the teaching is vast. So to study all the various Buddhist teachings is impossible. We need a guide, somebody who can distill the essence of it and also see what we actually need according to our particular conditions. So we need a guide, and that's the authentic teacher. If we have an authentic teacher, we trust him or her, then the qualities are transferred to us. It's not just about the behavior itself, but it's also qualities that we can gauge in our teacher that we begin to appreciate, and they actually begin to become part of us. The classical image then is if you go to a sandalwood forest or then you'll see that even trees that are not sandalwood, they actually begin to carry the scent of sandalwood. So likewise with us, staying with teachers, sublime beings. It of course applies that we need to be discerning in finding a teacher, in attending them, and in practicing what they teach. So we say, first be judicious, meaning have some discerning, some good common sense. Be judicious in finding a teacher. Then be judicious in attending him or her. Finally, be judicious in practicing his or her teachings. Whoever is judicious in these three ways will make unerring progress on the path of liberation. So the Tibetan word for judicious is kepa, which just means smart, but it has a sort of earthy quality of intelligence and discerning. So we just need to be smart in terms of approaching a teacher and then attending the teacher. This is Paltram, which says we should be like a bee that that picks up the pollen and then moves on without in any way aggressing the flower. And so being around a teacher, we could just see the teacher, hear the teaching, maybe be of service, but we don't need to be hardcore aggressive groupies that need to have the contact high and push and shove and need to sort of hang out with the teacher, which is very tiresome for the teacher actually. So to be light, have a light touch in terms of attending the teacher, to be of use, and then otherwise just retreat and be sort of you could say gentle. And then the main thing is actually then to apply the teachings of the teacher. So these three ways are the ways that we actually could progress on the path. Khyentse just says, in this decadent age, because of their limited intelligence and lack of determination, people need to practice the Dharma in an essentialized form. The practice of combining devotion to the teacher as inseparable from Chenrezi with the recitation of the six-syllable mantra fulfills this need. This six-syllable mantra, the Mani, or Mani Padma Hum, is so easy to recite, yet it concentrates within the substance. It concentrates within it the substance of all the Buddhist scriptures. It is the essence of Chenrezi's heart, and the blessing it brings are infinite. If you make it your main practice, humans, celestial beings, and even harmful spirits will be well disposed to you, and you will have a long life free from illness and obstacles. In your next life, you'll be born in the blissful Buddha field of the Potala mountain, or at the very least have a place where the Dharma prevails. So this is then what we're going to do, particularly in the context of this teaching. And Khyentse Rinpoche also makes the point that for us to actually succeed in this, the entire practice of the path, it's like anything. We need to be determined. That being said, presently, we do have all the conditions for overcoming the sole root of all ailments, ego clinging. So we do have all the conditions there to apply the path. We have all the conditions for succeeding in this endeavor. So then, in the next verse, then Paltram says, in this dark age, what people think and do is vile. None of them will help you. They'll deceive and trick you. And for you to be of any help to them will be hard. Wouldn't it be best to quit the whole rat race? Now, of course, we're not talking about the innate nature of all sentient beings, which is pure, but we are taking into account that beings, in being confused, their actions are confused, and then they're not helpful at all. This is not about being, misanthropic or not liking people, but it's really just acknowledging that they have certain limitations. So that's what we're talking about here. We're just talking straightforward in terms of making decisions about what to do with ourselves. So we should acknowledge that generally people's goals are not about enlightenment. And if we follow their examples, we'll be caught up in all the activities that they normally are concerned about. Getting ahead, having a wealth, and all these kind of things that are about worldly, secular, ordinary success. And if we follow that, then we're going to lose our Dharma. Again, this is not about making a big stink or statement about being opposed or being, you could say, politically opposed to the secular style of life. That's not it. We're not starting a new political party, but we're just understanding that people are confused, and we need to actually make sure that we can pay lip service, we can sort of be there politely, but it's important that we don't follow the examples of ordinary persons. We should care for others, but in doing so, we should be there for persons. But again, we shouldn't be distracted by their confusion. We shouldn't lose our way. To quit the rat race, we should put an end, and that's of course not about our behavior, about our sort of lifestyle. This is about what's happening inside ourselves. We should put an end to self-centering and the desires that come from self-centering. And that's where we could follow the example of the masters of the past. And again, it's more about emulating the quality of the masters of the past. Presently, in our culture, there are certain things that are a little bit difficult in terms of the structures that we have, but we certainly can look to the masters of the past and see how they worked on their own minds. Khyentse Rinpoche says, if you actually tried to achieve everything you want for this life, there would never be enough time. It is said, all those plans are like children's games. If we put them into action, they will never be finished. But if we just drop them, they're all finished at once. So again, we might think, oh, maybe someday I'll drop things, but that day is not likely to come. So these instructions are so helpful for understanding the situations we face every day, every moment. I feel so much compassion for others and myself, for the day-to-day delusions we live in. Yes, indeed. And thank you, I'm glad. Because what we have here is certainly not intended to generate a spirit of alienation, but it's just about, being frank about the degree to which we're caught up in confusion. So hence and of course this initial chapter here is very much about the aspect of renunciation, what we call the Hinayana, or the foundation of determination to abandon all ordinary entanglements. It's a waste of time looking after kin. This hits hard, though I realize there is truth there. Yes, this is where we're back to this rishi, this notion of Paltro Rinpoche and the Buddha as the rishis, in the sense that we and it's certainly not that we shouldn't be caring for others, but it's about not being deceived. And we might think it's tough, but sometimes actually, if you read some of our, the authors and the intellectuals we have in our culture, they are also really sometimes incredibly cynical about, about life. So it's not as if this is entirely new to us, but what we do come with here is an enlightened vision. So it's not just about, leaving things behind. Was struck by the consistency and unequivocability of the message that absolutely nothing about a worldly life is desirable. Yes, well, we have that a lot in the Buddhist teaching. Of course, there's ways then that we can apply this that enables us to integrate in various ways. But yes, like actually, Khyentse Rinpoche, he makes that point. He says we cannot fix samsara. As long as there is this basic delusion of fixating on a self, we're bound to, we have what it takes to be suffering. Being able to recognize how permeated with suffering this state of mind actually is, being as addicted to and affected by our habits and patterns. Big message is to become aware of and work on our own mind. Yes, that is what yep, that's true. That is what we're trying to do. In verse 10 then, Paul Rinpoche says, though you serve your superiors, they will never be pleased. Though you look after your inferiors, they will never be satisfied. Though you care about others, they won't care about you. Think about it and make a firm decision. Okay? Now, I hope at this point we're beginning to get the spirit, right? We're not too shocked about it. But it is put pretty bluntly something that we might actually recognize. Point is, of course, that we can never please everyone. If we begin to sort of kowtow to everybody, it's never going to work. So in that sense, the message here is that the only way is to free ourselves. Once we have that, yes, then we can be of help. And that, of course, is the whole, you know, at the end of this is a Mahayana teaching. It is about setting the foundation so that we can effectively help others. There's three ties that we talk about cutting here. It is the ties the entanglements that happen when we wish to gratify important people that we think are important, and it's about being free of the entanglement when we are trying to help others, because very often we just don't have what it takes. We might get exasperated and feel this is not helping. And then finally, there is being concerned about what others say about us or what they think about us. So all of these are actions that will exhaust us. And it's not just as if we're sacrificing ourselves for a noble cause, but it's exhausting us without actually having any ultimate benefit. So Khyentse Rinpoche says, true compassion is to establish beings in the deathless bliss of perfect Buddhahood. Now, this is, of course, constantly something within the modern world that it's a concept that we're not living with. If you're living in a Buddhist civilization, this would be present at all times and reflected in every stupa, every educated person, and so forth. In our culture, it's difficult. But that is, of course, where we then, we could say, we don't just uncritically subscribe to the notion of enlightenment. We want to, then we investigate this and we establish this on the basis of our own reasoning. So we should arrive at an insight that this is what we wish to accomplish ultimately. And that is where we then can benefit others. So presently then, in terms of the conditions that hold us back, we should be like a prisoner wishing to escape. The Kadampa masters, Atisha's lineage, they were famous for this saying, and you can see this quoted many places, base your mind on the Dharma, right? That's what we do. Base your Dharma on a humble life. Base your humble life on the thought of death. Base your death on a lonely cave. Now, we might think this is a bit extreme, but in fact, this translates very well within our given parameters, because to commit our mind to the Dharma can be done. Committing our Dharma to then a humble lifestyle, that's very possible. We just could live simply. We can also commit this humble life to within the awareness that it's not going to last. And basing your death on a lonely cave, well, I would say the modern civilization, they have provided that. Within the modern societies, you have very lonely deaths happening a lot. In fact, in places pretty much external to the modern world, then very often you're surrounded by, continually surrounded by families and so forth. But in the modern world, you could very well be sort of, committed to a very lonely situation. So that's not at all that strange to the modern person, actually. But of course, we are looking at here and thinking in terms of the Kadampa masters will think in terms of actually going to an empty valley and dying there without anybody knowing. But that kind of sense of liberating ourselves from the exhausting and pointless entanglements. Verse 11 reads, being learned these days doesn't help the teachings. It just leads to more debate. Being realized these days doesn't help others. It just leads to more criticism. Being in a responsible position these days doesn't help govern the country well. It only spreads revolt. Think about these times with sorrow and disgust. So we are presently then recognizing that yes, there was a time, and of course in the Buddhist teaching there was many great teachers that promoted being learned and so forth. And this also applies to the modern person approaching the teachings, because we do need to do a fair bit of reasoning and translating and so forth. And the implication also with debating, which is a familiar sort of face of monasticism, is actually that it enables us to become sharper in terms of our foundation and our clarity around the view. What are we actually doing in terms of the path? So the practice of debate is something that we have in the Buddhist teaching, and it could be quite helpful for modern people also, because it enables us to establish, you could say, an epistemic foundation, that we know why we're subscribing to this. It's the foundation of, you could say, a valid science. But the thing is, and what Paltram Rinpoche is referring to here, is that you're very often within, then, you could say, the somewhat insular, slightly inbred environment of monasticism and the institutions, the academic institutions, is then a fascination with just debating and a particular sectarian quality of seeing the opponent as being those people over there on the other side in terms of actual other Buddhist traditions and so forth. So that's where it can become a little bit destructive. So the implication here is that learning, while potentially beneficial, is often not appreciated. It becomes, the value of the learning is overlooked, and instead it becomes more about sectarian views. We hold this view, you hold another. So that's where the learned ones are not necessarily that respected, and also the realized ones, they're very often not recognized for what they are. You have, even in the history of Tibet, you have great masters such as Padmasambhava and Vimalamitra, who are seen as being just sorcerers and liars. When Vimalamitra came to Tibet, there was the Indians were very upset that he had left India, and they sent runners up to Tibet that spread evil rumors about Vimalamitra, so that when he arrived in Lhasa or Samye, then there was a lot of suspicion about him, and so forth. We have very often stories of great beings that are not particularly appreciated. So even they have difficulty in benefiting others. And of course, then also you have just and responsible rulers that that might potentially help others. Yeah, but then again, their motivation might be misperceived. And we have plenty of examples of that. I'll sort of restrain myself from coming from any comments about situations of apparently just leaders these days. So this is something that happens. So we should just not be too naive about what can be done in this day and age. And like Paltram just says, we should rather just think of this age with some healthy disillusionment. Verse 12 reads, though you explain, people miss the point or don't believe you. Though your motivation is truly altruistic, people think it's not. These days, when the crooked see the straight as crooked, you can't help anyone. Give up any hope of that. So Khyentse says, when in broad daylight, a group of blindfolded people agree that it's dark, the problem is surely their mistaken perception. The attitudes that are current these days cut people off from their inherent sanity. So what we have nowadays is that you might have some notion of what is truth and what's not, and there might be those who actually have some insights which fall outside of this sort of discursive hegemony, meaning the way that an idea rules a whole culture. And if you fall outside of that, then you're seen as being deluded. And of course, this applies to the sage. And even nowadays, people will say, "Oh, these sages or these monks or these yogis, they don't really understand the world. They're a bit helpless. They're sort of lost in their own little sort of." And there's a notion of identifying them with the proverbial ivory tower, or being bookish or sort of otherworldly and so forth. And that's based on a complete lack of understanding the nature of the Dharma. And as such, then, Dharma is seen as sort of inferior to the ordinary sciences of the world. And we think that we come across Buddhist concepts such as consciousness, rebirth, karma, samsara, and nirvana. And all of these are seen as simple beliefs. So this applies, this quote from Rinpoche very much applies to this sort of belief that exists when blindfolded people, they agree it's all dark. So what we have then in terms of the perceptions of, say, Dharma instructions, they're seen as a business, and also then they are conveniently framed according to particular cultural cliches about these kind of practices. And some might even say, well, if the Dharma is all about renunciation, that's exactly what I don't want that. My happiness is contingent on my worldly success and my possessions, those that I hold dear to me being there, and so forth. So Dharma might be seen as contradictory to happiness. Dharma teachers might not be trusted because they don't abide by the same they don't have the same objectives, the same ambitions, and so forth. And it also applies then within this day and age, then obviously elders are not listened to. Even parents that might have very good intention are sort of viewed with suspicion. And that's sort of a standard thing, It's almost inherent actually to modernity that if you're older, you're obviously not modern, and hence you're not qualified to have any insight at all. So by the mere fact that you are older, you're disqualified. So even with the best of intention, then that kind of, the elders are not listened to. The sole intention nowadays, and this, of course, this is actually written in, this is Khyentse commenting, but also this applied in Tibet. Tibetans and Asians are very pragmatic, if you like, and there's plenty of, you could say, attention on making money and also gaining power. So this is universal, it's not just particular to the modern materialism. And the point here, Khyentse Rinpoche says, it's better just to stay quiet and practice like Milarepa. And even if we might have an urban situation, we can still practice with that kind of determination. The Kadampa masters, again, Atisha's lineage, they would focus on cultivating kindness and compassion as inseparable from wisdom, the unity of wisdom and compassion. That's how they would practice, and that's how we would want to. Practice. And this unity of wisdom and compassion is, in essence, what we call bodhicitta, and that is this insight, the wisdom that sees through self-centering and which unleashes or frees the self-centering into great compassion. And so with these two qualities, wisdom and compassion, there's nothing that we cannot accomplish. Then again, if we put a lot of effort into doing all sorts of things, if we don't have wisdom and compassion, then again, it will also be pointless. It applies that we should first work on ourselves, and as we're doing so, then not mix our Dharma with our ordinary concerns, our ordinary ambitions, and so forth. Fascination with ordinary values come from ignorant assumptions. So if we were to look into some of the values that are promoted, we can actually see that the assumption is that phenomena exist in a way that they don't. And that's where it is valuable that we engage in an analysis that establishes emptiness. Shunyata. Khyentse says, normally we operate under the deluded assumption that everything has some sort of true, substantial reality. But when you look more carefully, you find that the phenomenal world is like a rainbow, vivid and colorful, but without any tangible existence. So that's where we need to have a clear understanding on the nature of our reality. So this is then expounded upon in verse 13, where it says, all phenomena are like magical illusions, said the Buddhas. But these days, the illusions are more illusory than ever. Trickeries conjured up by devious illusionists. Beware of the illusions of this degenerate age's ways. So this is before we even had all the magical stuff that, of course, our modern culture specializes in. But the point here is that we delude ourselves in three aspects, really. We delude ourselves in terms of our body, our speech, and our mind, physical, mental, and verbal phenomena. So here in this verse, we're looking more at the physical phenomena, the behavior and so forth of persons. And that's where we put some effort into analyzing this nature of reality, that it's illusion-like. When we say something is illusory, it means it actually doesn't exist. It appears, but it doesn't actually exist. And that's where we say nothing, anywhere, at any time has ever come into existence. And this is because as much as we might have been exposed to Buddhist philosophy, it's always something that sort of runs contrary to our sort of default assumption that phenomena have a reality. So it's something we need to be clear on. Like an illusion, something appears, yet has no actual reality. We could say all is like a drama, a theater piece, or a dream. So appears yet has no reality. And yet, everyone is deluded and take ever-changing delusions very seriously, planning about things, trying to avoid things, and so forth, worrying endlessly. With this in view, we should not fall for the shifting circumstances of gain and loss, because as we normally fall under the delusions, then we are continually held by all these various styles of hope and fear. So we would want to celebrate, acknowledge, admire, emulate the great bodhisattvas who are never fooled, even amidst business. Yet they are rare. If we look at the Tsongsa Khyentse Rinpoche has been teaching about Vimalamitra, someone who's a layperson, he lives in the world, and yet he's the epitome of wisdom. And we also have many masters who did this. Mapa, the translator. We had, in recent day and age, we have masters such as Dunjam Lingpa, Nyala, Pema Dundul, and so forth, that all lived like laypersons. And so while they were doing that, yet they were never for a moment distracted from wisdom. And we should also acknowledge this is rare. We might say, oh, I think I'll do that. Not so easy. So first thing is for us actually to follow the advice that's given here. Rinpoche says, if we can abandon all the busy activities of ordinary life, our Dharma practice will progress straight to its goal. Dharma practice and positive actions are no more real than illusions and dreams, but through these dreamlike merits, we will reach the dreamlike fruit of enlightenment. Let's see here. Okay. Might you speak more on base your death on a lonely grave? Is this speaking to anonymity even in death? Yeah, that is it. And it's really that, we might sometimes think, oh, when I pass away, I'll leave a glorious legacy behind and so forth. No, it's of course the bodhisattva is always going to be there, but there's sometimes some sense of glories around the death, and we would wish that we're surrounded by, our loved ones and so forth. So this is sort of a very brave commitment, really, and it's an aspiration. Also, it reflects then this spirit of determination. This is so true, such clear advice. It looks like we are called to renunciation while still entangled. It seems such an impossible task. Yeah, that's why we're getting help. We're luckily supported by a culture and a lineage and teachers that are guiding us in it. So at the end of the day, what might appear impossible is possible. Oh, cutting 3 ties. Oops, K, not grave. Yeah, got that. Though in essence the meaning might be the same. Yes. How does this message marry with the message of the Bodhisattva, which we are supposed to be practicing simultaneously to our own path to enlightenment? It is intrinsic to the Mahayana path. Well, that of course is what we're getting to. Right now we're just establishing the foundation, which is being very, you could say, brutally honest about the limitations of our ordinary expectations and projects. But of course, this is the foundation of the Mahayana path. The Mahayana, the Bodhisattva knows this, but then out of compassion for sentient beings manifests in the world. And so the Bodhisattva is not naive. It's not like the Bodhisattva doesn't really want to renounce samsara and then say, oh, I'm choosing to live in this confusion out of compassion. No, the Bodhisattva is very clear on what's what, and also clear on what it is that drives the suffering of others. And so the foundation of the path is this determination. So we very often see in for example, in the Kaji literature, we chant these verses where we say renunciation is the foot of meditation. And we also would start all the sort of tantric preliminaries with an awareness of these foundational considerations. So this is really just the foundation, and of course the main part of the teaching here that we get to will be about the Mahayana, what we call the view, meditation, and action. So we'll get to that. Okay. So we are going over time. We might go seriously over time today. Let's see. It also applies here. We need to recognize the two truths. And of course, in us discussing illusion, then what the nature of illusion is, it is something that on a relative level is what appears and is manifest. That's what we refer to as relative truth. We each experience our own particular perception of reality. So in every way, we refer to this manifest, apparent illusory manifestation as being relative truth. But being illusion, having no intrinsic nature, we say in absolute truth, this absence of any inherent reality, the actual empty nature of reality, that is the actual ultimate, you could say, status of phenomena. In relative truth, things exist on the basis of causes and conditions, and that means we cannot escape the law of cause and effect, karma. We never ever have something that we do that doesn't eventually manifest, and there's nothing that happens to us that isn't based on something that we've done in the past. To have our present conditions for practicing Dharma is rare. To have for anything to happen, there has to be all the causes and conditions. And the conditions for practicing Dharma is something that's very rare. Moreover, also in regard to this illusory nature of phenomena, we would say understanding impermanence helps us to realize this emptiness nature. The realization of absolute truth in its full realization is the scope of sublime beings. Of course, we temporarily would operate with a what we could call a conceptual understanding of what absolute truth is. And that's very important actually for us to clarify. But the actual realization, that is the scope of sublime beings. That can't be limited to some sort of formula. Overall, we would say these two, if we have something that is an illusion, like for example a rainbow, it's intangible and yet it's clearly manifest. So we would say these two aspects of truth, they live together as a unity. Then in verse 14 it says, all talk is like an echo, said the Buddhas. But these days it's more like the re-echo of an echo. What the echoes say and what they mean are not the same. So don't take any notice of those insidious echo words. So just like if we go out into some canyon and we shout out and the echo comes back, we know that there's not somebody there. It's unreal. Nobody actually made a statement. That's the nature of an echo. It's again one of the similes of illusion. And engaging in the ordinary words and the games of language and so forth that we ordinarily pursue, we would actually recognize the futility of so much conversation that we have. The late Trillian Normal Rinpoche, he would castigate his students for blurting. He would identify how a lot of the chat just comes from an insecure fear of just not filling space. And also so much of what we discuss and speculate about as it's reflected in our discussions are really futile considerations, speculations, opinions, and so forth. So what we're suggesting here, Khenzo Rinpoche suggests, is to replace this chatter with meaningful speech. Of course, we don't have to make a show of it, but basically the way that we generate also internal dialogues and so forth, it's very helpful, this advice to replace chatter with prayers, mantras, reciting, and so forth. Now, when it comes to us being praised, again, this is in the verbal dimension, right? There's no need to be excited. You could say that when we're praised, it's actually not for us. We must have done something that is somewhat egoless, or something that comes from practice, or we have some merit that generates this kind of favorable perception. We should just think they're not talking about us. His Holiness Dunjun Rinpoche, he would say, we should just think that they're talking about somebody who's passed away. And then if we're criticized, this is an opportunity for us to develop humility. We should say, wonderful, somebody's actually noticing and helping us. So we can see this as something that's constructive, and we can also see that it develops our humility. We should view criticism as our teacher. And we should also look again at bodhisattvas who are undisturbed by praise and blame. They really couldn't care less. And yet, as such, they become objects of great praise. So they're esteemed without seeking it. Khenzo Rinpoche says, so when you're complimented, think that it is solely because you have done what the Dharma teaches. When you're criticized, let it remind you to increase your compassion for others and to renounce your samsaric ways. Verse 15, whoever you see isn't human, but a fraud. Whatever people say isn't right, but just lies. So since these days, there's no one you can trust. You'd better live alone and stay free. So again, the image here is that we end up in in a country of man-eating ogres or demons. And as such, we just know the nature of the inhabitants. So we're not really in any way upset with them, but we're just known that there's a lack of clarity, there's a presence of confusion, there's a deceptive perspective that applies. So it's not that, again, it's not about people of the world being evil. In fact, of course, we're going to get to the Vajrayana perspective, and we're continually operating within the Buddhist path with the notion that confusion can be clarified. So innately, all humans are Buddhas. All phenomena are pure without the slightest impurity. The nature of all beings innately is bliss. But you see, right now, they're not experiencing bliss, they're not experiencing purity, and we're not perceiving it either. So we need to right now work with our immediate perception. And so understanding the confusion of beings is understanding that although they have an innate purity, there's a temporary condition of confusion that prevents this purity from being manifest. And so in this condition, then with all the goodness that might be present within beings, because of their confusion, we cannot trust anyone. And that's where we needn't think that we are dependent on them. Better to live alone. Again, this doesn't mean that we have to run to the mountains or give up everything and everybody, but it's more that we have some sense of autonomy, and that we have this sense that we can rely on ourselves, and for the time being we need to rely on ourselves. If we do, however, have the opportunity, of course, solitude is great, and within Buddhist context there is evolving culture about solitudes, retreats, and so forth. But even so, just retreating into doing daily practice and so forth, we have some degree of solitude, and this is the place where we can transform into bodhisattvas and be free of that which is then clearly pointless, futile. If you look at the songs of Milarepa, here there's some songs where Milarepa, he goes back to his home and he finds the bones of his mother and the house has collapsed and so forth. He sings a beautiful song about the futility of the world. So we needn't be defeated by this, but at the same time, we mustn't be naive and attribute value to that which ultimately is futile. So Khyentse Rinpoche says, if these attitudes truly take root, the qualities and achievements of the Mahayana, the great vehicle, are sure to grow from them. But if that genuine determination to be free from samsara is not firmly implanted in your mind, your Dharma practice will never be able to fully develop. This actually answers a question that we just had before. Of course, we're practicing the Mahayana, but we need to have that foundation that is free from a certain naivete. Verse 16, if your actions conform with Dharma, you'll antagonize everyone. If your words are truthful, most people will get angry. If your mind is truly good and pure, they will judge it a defect. Now is the time to keep your own way hidden. So presently, it's a good idea for us to just keep a low profile. And this means that we might in some way differ from others in terms of how we think about things and the values we might have. But then again, we needn't necessarily make a big fuss about it. We might have a discipline and a particular way of doing things, others that might be very different from how others are doing it. So we needn't make a show of that. We can just keep a low profile. Khyentse Rinpoche says, you had better keep your true worth concealed, like live embers buried under the ashes. So it's presently not the time to preach. People would probably get offended, or they would think that we have some agenda. It reminded me of some lines from Longchenpa's 30 verses of advice, where he says, giving advice with a wish to benefit and without self-interest, or lovingly pointing out someone's hidden faults, we might be honest, but it still creates heartache. To speak pleasantly is my heart advice. So Longchenpa, he gives these 30 pieces of advice, and they're immensely practical. And this is one of them. So even with the best of intentions, we should understand that we needn't give advice, and also we needn't also take advice from persons. People are erratic, they're confused. They think one way one day and they think the complete opposite the next day. And again, we have this also from Jigme Lingpa, where it says, never, even by your well-intended, closest, dearest ones, don't take advice. Take advice from your spiritual teacher. So then it applies then also that nowadays, in terms of low profile, also it applies that not everybody is particularly impressed with those who are ordained or those who follow the path and so forth. So in this way, we could just keep a low profile. So, hide your body by staying alone in a mountain wilderness. Hide your speech by cutting off contact and saying very little. Hide your mind by being continuously aware of your own faults alone. This is what it means to be a hidden yogi. So remember, this advice was written to one of Paltram Rinpoche's students who was a hermit living over in the far east of Tibet. At the same time, it doesn't mean that we, in an urban context or in a modern context, can't actually follow this advice, or that this advice is entirely unapplicable within our context. But what we might have to do is apply this as best we can within the given parameters that we have, and we can aspire to every once in a while do retreats. Anyway, the point is, however we do it, there's tremendous value in doing it, even if it's just going into a room that's quiet and sitting and doing some practice. The point is, it's helpful to remove our bodies from distraction. Also, just in terms of purely surviving in a very stressful and busy modern lifestyle, just actually allowing ourselves to have some peace and quiet is immensely curative and healing. Anyway, we should also understand this is why when you have the favorable conditions as there existed in Tibet and in the kind of civilizations that have this science of the mind, then these practices exist. It's not as if people were particularly, inclined to practice extreme ascetics of any kind. It was really just that there's freedom from distraction. And so the point is, in lonely places, then the mind recovers. The sort of ordinary worries and concerns of the mind gradually becomes less. Our kleshas and afflictions become less. And the capacity for meditation and presence of mind and so forth, the qualities of the mind naturally become manifest. So we should give up also the aspects of our speech that very often cause trouble, engaging in meaningless conversation. We should know the content of our mind and apply antidotes to its antics. And again, this is where we need to apply the instructions that we have, but the mind, going its own way, sometimes sort of spiral inwards and downwards, or gets up to all sorts of destructive patterns. If the mind is mastered, then body and speech follow suit. So if we have control over the mind, then our body naturally is more relaxed, and the speech also. Khyentse Rinpoche says, this inner control of the mind is the true spiritual master. The Dharma is something to be applied all the time. If not, what use can it be? So if Dharma was just some compartmentalized project that we have every once in a while, then we'd be without the benefit when we weren't using it. The Dharma is something that we would want to apply at any given moment. So a hidden yogi, so we're talking about here, what it means to be a hidden yogi. A hidden yogi only lives for mingling his mind with what is real, the Dharma. A yogi has this objective, is not seduced by or naively fascinated by what is superficial and inconsequential. The yogi is clear about what has genuine value and applies himself or herself to that. So we should allow ourselves. I think probably there should be a negation here. We should not allow ourselves deluded hesitations about food and shelter. So this is where we very often would say, well, let's be sensible here, and let's make sure we can't not think about all of this and that and the other. And the truth of the matter is that if we begin to sort of get caught by these ideas, we will end up basically kowtowing to these agendas. So Khyentse Rinpoche says, as long as these inveterate tendencies continue, so will suffering. So meaning, as long as we continue to sort of act on our insecurities around these issues, then our suffering is not going to end. Khyentse Rinpoche continues, you will never be a good Dharma practitioner until you're truly sick of ordinary life and know how to be satisfied with whatever you have. And again, of course, it applies, doesn't mean that we should be alienated or think, like Trungpa Rinpoche made a point about how in the 70s the hippies thought that cities were evil and they should go and live in the countryside and live off the land and so forth. There's not any kind of alienation that we're proposing here. There's not. But at the same time, it's about not being gullible about what's what. And that's where we would understand that some of the things that we are fascinated by, they're not really worth being fascinated by. Okay, at this time we're coming up to having done an hour and a half, so I'm not quite finished, but I think we'll probably conclude here. I'll just take the last questions and then we'll continue next time. Blame and ill treatment are the roots of the meditation flower. Doubt, why does it refer to roots of meditation flower? Well, actually, Paltram Rinpoche has a wonderful teaching. I should actually I'll post it in the resources, where he says, let's see here. Well, basically, he says that when we have suffering, or when we're being ill-treated, right? Then actually it turns the mind away from fascination with what is superficial. He says, I like to, when we suffer, then the mind turns to the Dharma. So when we receive this kind of ill treatment, we really get annoyed. And that's where we really, you could say, wish to not be caught up in the ordinary conditioning. And this drives us really to practice. We have many stories about people who, in extreme conditions, actually their practice flourished because of the difficulties they faced. If we see the emptiness of criticism, then why keep our own way hidden? Well, yeah, I think that's answered, right? Yeah. Yeah. If we see the emptiness of criticism, well, right now we're working on that. It's not as if we've seen it fully. And as we're work in progress, it might be helpful to keep a low profile. I think that's the answer. Yeah, if I'm honest with myself, practicing out of retreat is really challenging because our minds are constantly dragged away by even the minor mundane problems. Even if with a more recluded lifestyle. Yes, so I mean, we go to the mountains and we'd be surprised how many of our ordinary patterns repeat, even in a very simple lifestyle. So it is very much about what is being said here, working with the mind above all. But then again, the message here is that there is a lot of value in having that renunciation and determination that that we could actually exist beautifully without all the things that we normally think that we need. Okay, so didn't quite complete all of the material today, but we'll do that next time. It's doable. So for next time, read the rest of what we didn't cover today, and then also read part 2, the beginning of part 2, which is the view, meditation, action of the Mahayana, and read the section which is then Path of Sutras up to the Path of the Tantras. Thank you. By this positive action, may all beings perfect the accumulation of merit and wisdom, and attain the 2 supreme kayas, which arise from merit and wisdom. Thank you.